Is this on? Yeah. Good afternoon. I'm Annie Medaglia. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Global Energy Center, and I'd like to welcome you to the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center event series, The Road to Paris. We're thrilled to see such an amazing turnout today, but Google does that for people. We're going to focus on the nexus of energy, technology, and climate. And this conversation comes at a moment when the attention of the international community is fixed more than ever on the need for global climate action. And after spending much of our inaugural year focused on the road to Paris, we're now shifting to the road through Paris. So no matter the outcome of COP21 talks in December, there'll be an enormous amount of work that remains to be done on access to clean energy that's reliable and affordable while curbing carbon emissions. So the importance of the private sector to these efforts cannot be overstated. Our clean energy future will be largely shaped by the private sector innovation, investment, and development. Today's most critical private sector work on energy and climate issues is not, however, limited to traditional energy companies. And in recent years, companies like Google have emerged as key players at the forefront of the global energy sector, putting their prowess in technology, data analytics, to work to help propel gains in areas ranging from energy efficiency to renewable energy deployment. So they've also emerged as major investors in the kind of the next generation alternative energy technologies, playing a central role in clean energy financing. Google alone has funded over $2 billion in renewable energy projects across the world. And the role of companies like Google is addressing the energy challenges of today and tomorrow. It's only set to expand. So for this reason, we're very pleased to have John Wooler joining us today to discuss these issues. John has had a distinguished career as a private sector leader in clean energy technology prior to joining Google as the Vice President of Energy in 2014. He served as President and CEO of BrightSource Energy and as an advisor to Vantage Point Venture Partners. In his current role, John focuses on Google's global energy strategy through investments in new technology and creation of new business opportunities. Moderating today's discussion will be Heather Zeichel, our non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlanta Council's Global Energy Center. Heather most recently served as Deputy Assistant to the President for Energy and Climate Change, coordinating the White House efforts across this space. So needless to say, we're very excited for today's discussion. And I would encourage you all to join and contribute to the discussion through Twitter at #ACEnergy. And with further ado, I'll turn things over to Heather and John, if you want to come up.
Oh, I should have gone up the side.
Great. Well, thank you for that kind introduction, and certainly thank you, John, for joining us today. You know, for a lot of us, Google is a household name, but I think about it when I log on to my email. So can you talk to us just a little bit and give us a 30,000-foot view of how does Google think about energy, and what does the Vice President of Energy for Google think about?
Sure, glad to. I'll try to put this in context fairly efficiently. We cover a lot of areas in energy. We touch a lot of places. But think of Google first as we're a large buyer of power. We are one of the larger consumers of energy. So when we do buy power, we try to buy renewable power, zero carbon power, and we look at how to do that in a responsible way. So we look at the content of the grid itself where we're buying, and then we also look at how we can drive either directly by purchasing or by influencing utilities how to drive more zero carbon power in that area. We also invest in energy, so a totally separate group. We generally keep the procurement and the investment separate. We invest quite a bit. They mentioned earlier that we've done about $2 billion in energy investments, primarily renewable energy. Those tend to be very friendly from a project finance perspective. So we've put, I think it's now $2.2 billion in to drive 2.5 gigawatts of renewable projects, mainly started in the U.S. and now we're looking more overseas. And then the third category is really on the technology front. So we look at how do you apply Google's technical capabilities to drive towards a more interesting energy future. So we do it in everything from efficiency to data centers. Our data centers are 3.5 times as efficient as they were just 5 years ago. So efficiency is a big lever that we like to pull and something we like to focus on, to building new products that enable sort of the grid to flex more on the demand side. We acquired a company, Nest, a while ago. Nest is a wholly owned subsidiary that looks at how how you live in your home, but then also how you interact with the grid and how to make that more interesting and dynamic. So
Great.
A lot of categories, but that's a quick summary.
Yep, helpful overview.
Yeah.
So one of the things you mentioned was Google's commitment to purchase 100% renewable energy, and you announced that back, I believe, in 2012. Just yesterday here in Washington, over 81 companies assembled at the White House to commit to what's called the American Business Act on Climate Pledge. And one of the things many of the member companies did was also commit to that 100% purchase of renewables. Talk to me a little bit about, like, why do you think companies are choosing to make this decision? Why now? Why was what allowed Google to be at the forefront of this opportunity, and sort of what's the general thinking from the private sector about opportunities with respect to renewables?
Yeah. Well, first, I think it's great that we've got so many companies stepping up. To me, that just shows that it used to be we weren't alone, but it felt lonely. We were one of the few that was thinking about it a while ago. You had Walmart early coming in and thinking about things, and I think Walmart came in and really woke people up just as Google did. But this was all more like a decade ago. I was talking to some utility executives recently who hadn't really realized that most, if not most, of their major industrial and commercial industrial customers are going to demand this into the future. So the paradigm really is changing, and it's frequently customer-led. So we try to use our ability to influence things as a large customer or consumer of these of the product to drive change. And I think it's great that you have more and more companies joining in. But your question, part of it was why now? And I think there is a lot more focus in the commercial and the industrial world being put on it now, given the fact that Paris raises visibility, the conference coming up, and the negotiations start to raise the visibility and the urgency. Plus, there's just more data and information out there that this is the debate is more or less over. Unfortunately, not politically, but from a for most people who have a high school level of statistics or greater, there's not a lot of questioning about the, is this a real issue? Is it something that we need to attack? So corporate executives in multiple categories look at this and say, this is a real issue. It's something that we really need to dive into, and we need, in the absence of other leadership, we need to step up and at least make it clear that we think it's a problem and we're willing to do something about it.
So we talk about Paris, we talk about the private sector. From your perspective, is there anything missing from the Paris talks that would catalyze greater investment in clean energy?
So I'm not an expert on the Paris talks, but I do get, there's a lot of voluntary action being contemplated there, and I think that if you add up all the activities, it's a great start. The optimist in you says it's a great start, and you want to have a framework developed. The realist in me, who's spent a lot of time in some of the climate models and fairly deep in this, says it's the first thing we've got to realize is that even if it's successful with what's being proposed, we've got to immediately be thinking about what's next, because it's not, and it's a good start. But to really get to, if you're going to solve for 450 parts per million, it's a much more complicated and deeper challenge. And so I think, hopefully it'll be, and you need to audit, you need to track, you need to have trading mechanisms in place, and you need to look at the lowest cost way to do this, because if you mandate too much, it can be very inefficient. So I'd hope that there's more on pricing, bringing that externality in and pricing it, rather than too many mandates that can drive cost up. Right.
So, I think stepping forward and thinking about what implementation of a global climate treaty might look like, obviously the key is making sure everybody is involved. The United States has certainly been stepping up, China's been stepping up, but what's the role and the opportunity in developing countries? And I want to congratulate you for the exciting news today from Google that you announced the largest wind energy project investment in Kenya today with Lake Turkana, 300 plus megawatts, which is amazing, more power to meet the needs of over 2 million households, on top of your other major solar project in Africa. Can you talk a little bit, why are you investing in Africa, and what other emerging markets do you see in the developing world?
Well, first, the reason we're focused on Africa is it's a growth. I mean, we do this commercially. We're not making grants here. These are investments. So we invested a lot in the U.S. over years and really developed a lot of internal expertise in project financing, and became very, very good at deploying capital into projects at scale. And we always were a little more risk-seeking than, say, a bank might be, so we're risk-tolerant. But we had the ability to go in and either dive deeper on the engineering side, or deeper on the sort of financial and commercial risk side than others might be willing to. We then would take, but then also we would have stronger returns because of that. So if you take a little more risk or understand that risk, you can, that disconnect, it's something that you do very well from on the investment perspective. In the US, I think this is good news. It started to get much more competitive, and returns started to go down, and capital started to free up. If we could do that in other places, that would be phenomenal, because if you can be a group that goes in a little ahead, takes understands the risk, dives in, does the work, and then can bring more efficient capital to bear over time and then move to the next category. That would be, we would love to do that for the next several decades. Sub-Saharan Africa is very interesting because it's got a very large underserved population. So, worldwide, I think 1.3 billion people have no access to electricity, and almost half of that is the largest single place is Sub-Saharan Africa.
Right.
And so, as we look at there's the access to the grid, and then as you bring people on, how do you make sure it's done in a clean or a decarbonized way? We want to make sure that we are willing to provide that risk capital into those types of projects. So we did a project in South Africa that was the largest PV project in Sub-Saharan Africa. Lake Turkana is largest in Sub-Saharan Africa, and I think John Cornick can correct me. It's all of Africa, is that right? Largest wind project, renewable project in all of Africa, at 310 megawatts. It's about 15% of the grid in Kenya, and it's a really attractive project. It's a phenomenal wind resource. It's a great region where you've got capacity factors that are strong. You've got economics that are strong. To us, it's just a great. But you have to be able to understand the risk of going into into investing in Sub-Saharan Africa. Everything from getting the turbines to the construction site to making sure you understand any of the currency or the political risk and dynamics makes it a more complicated project. But you should get rewarded for the complexity. And
Right.
we like the types of projects that other people might not might find a little challenging.
Right, right. So one thing when we think about Sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of people talk about this technology leapfrog, and I'm curious to know what your thoughts are. Is this notion that Sub-Saharan Africa will sort of take a technology leapfrog akin to the mobile phone with respect to energy, which is to say, they will learn from the bad mistakes we've made and move straight to clean energy solutions. What do you think about that?
Well, I think you will see a very fast adoption of some of these far from grid solutions in Sub-Saharan Africa, but it's still tough to beat the power of a network. So I think sometimes that phone analogy is a little bit can be misleading, because when phones started you started to have cell phones distributed, you still wanted to talk to somebody else on that phone. So the network existed. It's a physical network of wires, and it becomes a network of wireless. But networks have power in the number of nodes, and the interdependency is very a powerful part of networks. And we live in the network world. So if you look at power, it's very the first thing, if I had solar and you had wind, the first thing we would do is then put a wire between our two villages so that we could share, and then you'd put a wire to the next one. You always end up rebuilding some type of grid or sharing infrastructure, because it's very inefficient to do one-to-one matching of a resource and battery storage, for example. So we think that networks are definitely where things ultimately go and persist over time, but that doesn't mean that you can't take the hundreds of millions of people that are far from the grid and change their lives tomorrow without being on the network. They just don't have full reliability and grid backup. So we do see a lot of progress on the small solar kits that are enabled by lithium-ion battery technology, by LED lighting, that are very cost-effective. They compete with kerosene lighting, really. I mean, your cost of you're looking at, I can outcompete kerosene lighting all day long, and the cost of charging my cell phone and walking to charge my phone with a remote kit. Now that remote kit still has limits, right? It's still not as robust. I can't, run what you might consider a Western lifestyle, because I can't have 24/7, 4/9 reliability unless I start to make it really big. So I think that frequently the cell phone piece can be a misleading analogy, but ultimately networks are strong, they're resilient, they're redundant. It's going to change. The networks are going to change even in the US. The network model is going to change. But this concept of leapfrogging, I think of it more with the small solar kits as enabling. You're leapfrogging kerosene, but eventually what we've looked at is a lot of those homes would still like to eventually be on a robust and a grid that's reliable and that works and functions.
So pivoting a little bit in doing a deeper dive on the technology piece of this, I've heard a lot about Google X, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that program and sort of what you're most excited about.
Yeah. Sure. So our rule internally for Google X is if you can Google it, you can talk about it. But so some of the projects are very much secret, and we don't talk about. But I talk about what I can Google. So we do have some fairly interesting projects there. I think most people are aware of our autonomous driving projects, and the self-driving car is something that is it works technically. It works today. The technology's there. It's very robust. It's got it outdrives practically every demographic that there is already. It's going to be very challenging from a permitting and getting people comfortable with it. But I drive whenever I pass one and I'm getting ready to do my commute home. I wonder why I'm driving and not sitting in the back of a self-driving car today. The technology's there, so it's going to be adoption and models that are going to be important as it moves out. But that's not any more of a technical challenge. It can do a lot for utilization rate of cars and assets, and there's been some interesting work if you optimize, if you don't own cars and you actually share and you optimize around routes, you can cut down on fuel consumption, you can cut down on, the worst thing is the one-to-one, the radial, the one-to-one trips that we all take in our cars where we're going out and back versus optimizing a route and then picking things up along the way. And I think when you look at something like Uber and sharing, 80% of Uber's cost is labor. So think about what automated driving and would do to something where it makes it even more efficient and,
right.
and less expensive. There's a lot. That'll be a fascinating. I think several decades ahead on the autonomous driving. There are in Google X. There are other projects that focus on. We have high altitude balloons that we've actually talked about publicly, called Project Loon, where we are looking at basically internet connectivity by floating balloons at 60,000 feet and having them connect in a mesh network so that you can enable internet connectivity everywhere in rural areas that are not dense and in the developing world. And I think that's going to be very interesting as we watch how that moves forward. And I think those are the ones that come to mind I can Google. Did I forget any? I'm looking at my team in the back. Anything else we can talk about at Google X? Oh, Makani, yeah. So we actually bought a company, Makani Wind Systems, that was looking at high altitude or medium altitude now wind, where the wind blows much more reliably up above the 700 feet that you would normally site, where you would normally site a turbine, and you can do it for a materials that are about 5% of the total materials cost. You just have to solve some other problems. So we have basically designed high altitude wind turbines that are tethered to the ground that basically can harvest much more of the available wind, and that's being tested now, and we're we'll be rolling that out over the next several. It's still in pilot and test mode. We'll see how ultimately the economics pencil out on that.
Interesting.
But a lot going on. Google X has their mindset is basically they look at 10 to 100x improvement. They try to think of things that are really going to disrupt. And to put it in context, I should probably, Google has its own, we follow and have from the beginning a 70-20-10 investment paradigm. So of all the capital that we deploy, 70% goes into the core business. 20% goes into what most companies would consider R&D, but that's associated with the core business. How do you develop new technologies or associated technologies that help advance your core? And then 10% is just the radical, completely disruptive, high risk, high reward projects. And we really encourage that 10%. We really want to make sure we incubate and are always thinking about how to push those more disruptive models. So there's a very much of a risk, a high tolerance for risk and a desire to foster innovation that is very, permeates the whole culture.
So if you, sitting here today, had to make your predictions about where you're going to see the biggest disruptions in the clean energy sector and sort of energy services management, what would you predict?
So a big unexplored and unexploited category is the whole demand side. We've lived in a world where supply and demand, the equation was basically viewed as demand is fixed, and then we dispatch generation to meet that demand, and you've got the ultimate real-time commodity, which is electricity.
Right.
Once you generate it, it better be consumed, or it's more perishable than lettuce. And it's not connected in a real-time market. And so we have a big disconnect between supply and demand. And if you get that market to function, if you get demand to interact with supply, you start to send price signals in, you start to actually not have to run your peakers as often, you shut down some of the most polluting peakers by flexing demand. And there's a lot of willingness to do everything from daylight harvesting to adjusting temperature set points. And I don't think we've done anywhere near enough to exploit what can happen on the demand side. The demand side is unexplored territory. So a lot's going to happen there. And then, of course, that zero carbon, fully dispatchable power source that somebody's going to invent is the next big one. But I'll leave it to we'll
Do you want to make a prediction on that?
But it does bring up the fact that we do need things like that to be focused on. You can do a lot with renewables, but we also all have to recognize their limits, and so you need to really focus on dispatchability of zero carbon sources that are massive and scalable if we're going to solve the climate issues.
So setting the right metrics as we think about our policies going forward is clearly important. And as much as everyone loves renewables, I think there's a question to be asked about, is the right metric maximizing renewables, or is it minimizing carbon? And I know that's a conversation that Google is starting to think about, and I'm just sort of wondering, what are your views, and how would you see Google being part of a broader conversation around this?
Yeah, it's a discussion that we have a lot internally, and we do think that carbon needs to be the metric, not just renewables, because you can have massive success on renewables, as you mentioned, and still not solve the carbon problem, because it's a very, very big, complicated problem. So first you begin with 35% of the, really 35% is the electric sector. The rest is transportation and industrial heat and cement and all these other big categories of carbon generation that you're not going to, even if you did solve the electrical piece, you're not going to solve the rest. So I think we think of really measuring and focusing on 450 parts per million in 2050 as a very clear and very precise and very objective way to think about the system is a better way to think about it than to build up and cobble up from a renewable mandate here, another renewable mandate in a different state over there. And so renewables are part of a solution, but it's a very complicated system. And so you don't want to just incent. Too much of any one thing can be challenging, and so diversity is good. Dispatchability really matters. So we tend to think through a lot around setting goals that are more carbon focused than just renewable focused, and shifting that whole discussion to one where we're really trying to solve a carbon problem, and we need to have the guts and the courage to talk about carbon and not just talk about some of the things that feel good,
right?
But really address the issue.
I mean, has there been I mean, how has the internal conversation been? Has it been, moving a rock up a mountain, or is?
Oh no, internally it's easy. It's how do you talk about it externally?
Outside.
Or right, we're very. There are a lot of very data-focused people inside the company,
Yes, I can imagine.
So we look at data and information and think through what the right things are from a system perspective. And what we want is we don't want, if you do things but we're also a big buyer of power, so we care about cost. So if we do things in ways that are going to not solve the carbon problem as efficiently but drive up costs, we prefer mechanisms that are going to do both, that are going to do it at the lowest cost possible. And so the best way to do something at a lower cost is to allow for a portfolio and a lot of competition in that portfolio, not just pick a winning category or a single technology.
Terrific. Well, I'm going to ask you one more question, and while I'm doing that, I'd like everybody here in the room to start thinking about the questions that you have for our wonderful panelists. And I know we have some microphones, I believe, out there. As you are thinking of your most difficult questions, I will wrap up with one more. I mean, there are a lot of energy people in the room today, and there are a lot of tech sector people in the room today. What do you think, what lessons can the energy sector learn from the technology sector?
That's a good question. I think if there's anything, the tech sector is very, very good at rapid innovation, rapid iteration, rapid prototyping. And I think if there's anything missing in sort of the older energy sector, it's the ability to move very quickly, to iterate, not get it perfect, but to get out there with something that you can experiment with, get feedback from, and then, so I think the way to innovate is not to do 5 years of detailed planning and then build something. Frequently it's to do 6 months of damn good planning, but not perfect, and then get out there and then try and then learn what you're going to learn about either the business model or the technology or some of the risk, and to pilot and to do more, to increase those innovation cycles would be the one thing I would encourage the energy sector to do more of.
Interesting. Okay, questions?
Terry Hill with the Passive House Institute. Given that Google is very much into the data center space, and you're now generating electricity in Africa, and the National Science Foundation is just funding research in direct current, what role do you see for direct current in the future of the energy space?
Yeah, interesting. So there are, if we look at our data centers, they're much more efficient than they used to be, and a lot of it is, we keep a lot of it proprietary, but we also, I think, do talk about how we don't just have AC circuits everywhere, right? Direct current can be a very efficient way to design things. I think you have systems that need to transport over long distances. You have everything from high voltage DC is a phenomenal way to do very efficient long distance transport. Unfortunately, and we're building some of those lines, but not enough. I think that on a transmission perspective, high voltage DC, even within an AC system, can be a very efficient way to deliver power over long distances with minimal losses. And then as an end use, we shouldn't feel, as we design and optimize things like data centers, we shouldn't feel constrained by the AC current. We should start to look at where should we be using DC and where should we be using AC from an efficiency perspective.
Other questions?
The first question I have for you is when you spoke a lot about your project finance. At approximately what IRR does it get interesting to Google, or at what levelized cost of electricity would it get interesting to Google?
Yeah, I'll try to give some broad ranges because we don't have a single number anywhere. But as equity participants, we're not debt providers, right? We are equity participants.
But you don't lever your equity?
Oh, we do.
Okay.
Yeah. So we generally, if you take, and this outside of Google, just I think of any. If you look at an unlevered project, projects are generally interesting if they get into the 9, 10, 11% unlevered range, and 12% is even better, right? So if you look at when we built out, all the natural gas infrastructure in the 90s, when you have 10 and 11% unlevered, lots of projects get built, and as you get below that, less capital just comes in. So I think that's probably the single best metric out there. Then you can look at leverage, you can look at how to apply debt and then get a higher levered return. But in general, I'd say 10% and greater on an unlevered basis means you're going to get a lot of capital. You should be able to finance any projects that are in that range.
And LCOE?
Well, LCOE is going to be dependent on so many things, right? It's different. It's a different number in the U.S.
So your wind project in Africa, approximately what's the LCOE that's interesting to you guys?
I don't think we disclose. I don't know if there's any discussion on LCOE that's public. But
Okay.
just to make sure people understand what's complicated here, that's the levelized cost of energy for a project, and it'll be different in a U.S. where it's subsidized with the production tax credit than in Europe where it's not subsidized but you have a feed-in tariff. So you can build the same project and it'll look like it has a lower LCOE or a lower cost to the off-taker, but so subsidies and taxes can distort that somewhat. So it's geographic, and then the other thing that distorts it is you'll have sometimes there's a if you have a long transmission line, you might prefer something that's closer in but has a higher cost than something that's further out but has a lower LCOE. So there's no perfect answer on LCOE at all. I would say generally competitive, within plus or minus 10% of the local market, and it'll be a function of the local market.
So, just the last question. I apologize. So, if you were, from Google's perspective or from your perspective, what would be some policy changes or policy implementations that governments could do, which could really take this, make this market take off?
Yeah, I think if we, some way to bring that externality in, whether it's cap and trade or a carbon tax or whatever the mechanism, but a way to make sure that all zero carbon sources are viewed in the same way would be the single most important step. That way you wouldn't have a very difficult time comparing lots of awkward subsidies, but you could look at one single metric, which would be the right one, which would be what is that externality of the price of carbon? Yeah.
So one of the things I think I've always respected about Google is the sort of open architecture that you guys push forward in the space through Android and others.
Mm-hmm.
But have you thought about how that might be integrated into your approach to technology and renewable technology? Whereas Google innovates quite a bit internally right now. Have you thought about maybe figuring out how to catalyze external innovation a bit more than you already do?
Yes. So we've done a few things already externally. We did, but we should do more. One thing we did was inverters are a big challenge. Back to your AC/DC question, and there are losses in inverters. They're inefficient. They're expensive, and we thought that they were just too poorly designed. So rather than go design new inverters, we held $1 million challenge where we said we'll give $1 million prize to anybody who can take these characteristics of an inverter that would basically power a house today and shrink the form factor by a factor of 10, so that it's basically the size of a laptop computer, but still meet all the same criteria from a voltage and from a switching perspective. And we now have, I believe it's like 30 teams that are focused on trying to win this prize. So sometimes just by putting a prize out there, and all of it's going to be open sourced, all the IP is going to go to the whole world. We might find some insights in there that we know how to use ourselves, but also everything's going to be available to the general public. So I think those are very interesting tools and techniques. We'll get way more than the value that, we hope we write the check, right, at the end, because that's a great thing. If we don't, we've still catalyzed a good discussion, a good debate, and we've gotten lots of great learnings. So that's one place where I think we do some, we could always do more. The others, we're looking at how to work with some of the NGOs and others around some of the climate, some of the modeling and the scenario planning. So we're trying to think through ways that we can use what Google's good at to get better data and information out there.
Yes, hi, I was wondering, I was very positively struck by your answer about looking at a portfolio of energy technologies. And I was wondering if Google is looking at all at next generation nuclear technologies, whether they're small modular reactors or some of the more fringe technologies that startups are trying to get up off the ground, and what Google's general position is on next generation nuclear technology.
Yeah. So as we look at, we always start with carbon and back into the portfolio. So if the issues around waste and proliferation can get resolved, then nuclear should be a huge part of the portfolio. And it could be one of the few resources that is, can be base load, that is reliable, that has spinning mass, it has great characteristics, and it's zero carbon. So we added, if you added up all the residential rooftop in the entire United States, it's less than half of one nuclear plant, right? So, and nuclear's got this scale that's just meaningful. So we have to think through how we, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to solve climate change without resolving some of the issues around nuclear and solving it at scale. So we want to encourage anybody who's out there thinking about next generation. We're not going to be very directly involved, but right now 60% of the zero carbon power on the grid in the U.S. is from nuclear, still, and so we need to think about it. We need to do it thoughtfully, and we need new technologies, and we need a governmental process here in the U.S. that encourages the development of new technology, because right now I think that's not working as well as it could here, and so a lot of it's happening overseas, which is unfortunate. Yeah.
On the PTC, hey, thanks. On the PTC, I was wondering if Google does any federal advocacy or federal legislative affairs surrounding that issue, and how the PTC affects both your investment and procurement side of your energy dealings.
Yeah, no, we try to stay away from the direct advocacy on any of this. So we let others, the wind industry does plenty, and the solar industry does quite a bit on their own. So we let and we try to remain a fairly objective buyer and investor of both. So, we at the end of the day, it's just one way of, you're either going to price the externality in from the top, or you're going to subsidize from the bottom. Right now, we've chosen to do the subsidy route rather than bringing the price in. But either one will work. One's just kludgier over time and not as effective.
Thanks.
Hi, Sharon Bodat, Voice of a Moderate. Quick question. When it comes to technology and the green issues that Google's getting involved with, when they find something that doesn't work, are they quick to back off and not spend that taxpayer money or their own money? For example, like the electric car chargers that are really important, but there were two standards. There was the CHAdeMO and then the other standard. So some electric car chargers only worked on Japanese cars, where others worked on German cars. And they weren't in sync. So if you wanted fast charging, you had to use one or the other. And there were counties that paid a lot of money for electric car chargers that only work on Japanese cars. Mm. And I'm sorry I'm out of breath, but the metro was really bad today. So I'm being green. But at the end of the day, my question is that when you do find something that there is a glitch or there is a problem, like two different standards for electric car chargers that taxpayers are funding, and we need to unite so it can be a success, what is Google's perspective when they're investing with this type of infrastructure that has to be created?
I would probably divide this into two. Part of it was, what does Google do when we see projects that don't work, and internally we like to fail fast. So, I'll get to this other part of your question, but I think really internally we like to say, what are the single hardest things about a project, and line the hard ones up early so that if you can fail quickly, that's great, because then you know that the worst is to do all the easy stuff first, and then 3 years in say, oh, we forgot about this one big meaty thing, and so we've wasted time, money, and the biggest cost, I think, internally at us and at any company is opportunity cost. What could you have been working on? What else could you have been working on? With regard to standards and multiple standards, and we haven't encountered much there that's been from an investment perspective where we've had challenges. If we did, we would, I'm sure, fold it into the investment. We'd say, well, that would be a risk, and it might be a risk that means we don't move forward with an investment. If there are, from a lot of our investment, it has to be fairly unambiguous what's going to happen, because we're deploying, and it's project financing. It's not corporate. It's not venture risk capital. This is project investing that we're doing in the energy sector. So, we like to minimize the risk, and if there's multiple standards or conflict or ambiguity, that generally would probably be something we wouldn't move forward with. But I can't say we've run into it that I know of. Yeah.
Yes, hello. Thank you for your presentation. First of all, I hope that you have enough business cards, because I'm one of them that's going to get it from you.
I probably don't.
Well, you're going to need more, maybe around 100 here right now. The second thing, talking about artificial intelligence, how would you feel if all of a sudden I bring in here a robot and replace you, and to make it, for this robot to make a decision rather than you doing it as we speak? So it's a big issue going on around that robotics is taking someone's. For example, you put a robot on a board, and he's the one who's going to make a decision for the shared person these days. So just wondering how would that make you feel if that happens right now?
Well, I'd go to Starbucks and have a coffee first. And no, I think that there's a lot of complexity around art. I would separate robotics and things that are very helpful from artificial intelligence. So you can automate a lot in very interesting ways, but you generally humans are still part of the decision making and the chain. And artificial intelligence is getting more interesting in terms of informing decision making, but I think we're a long way away from what you might call, people talk about the singularity, or where things really cross over, and that's we've got a long way to go. But the benefits of bringing in massive amounts of data, of machine learning, where we've taken a very small number of Google engineers and applied machine learning to some problems in energy, where you've gotten really, really attractive returns in the performance of an asset in a category where a human just couldn't handle 100 different variables that need to get changed and played with at once. So it's amazing what you can do right now. I'm much more fascinated with the potential than concerned about the replacement of by a robot. But I think there's a lot. The potential is absolutely phenomenal, and generally there are humans that are part of the setup, the interrogation, the decision making. But what you can do with machine intelligence is really interesting. Yeah.
Hello, hi, my name is Whitney Bernstein, and I'm a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow. And my question for you is about the grids that you mentioned before, networking, and kind of how we're in this networking world. And so as you deploy different energy technologies in developing countries, those might connect up then to provide more reliable energy. And I was just wondering if you could speak to the other side of that, which is energy transmission is less efficient, right? So you lose a lot of energy in transmitting the energy. Mm-hmm. And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts about kind of the democratization of energy production in microgrids and that kind of framework in when you're thinking about developing new energy frameworks in developing countries. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, and specifically the way I heard your question was developing countries not in a strong grid market where the grid exists. Is that right? So
where there's
yeah.
Building a new grid
Yep.
or new concept
Yep.
for how to deliver energy.
Yeah. So you've identified most of the issues to consider, but you look at transmission losses, and transmission losses are, especially if you get back and you use high voltage DC, are fairly minimal. So but transmission's not easy to build. So, to me, if you were to start from scratch, the perfect grid is going to be dynamic. It's going to be self-healing. It's going to have the ability to incorporate lots of different sources of generation. You need that diversity of generation. But every time I get, a grid over here, call it a microgrid, and a grid over there, and a third grid, there's always going to be a cost benefit of what is the distance to that wire, and what's the benefit of backing up one with the other. And generally, that calculation encourages you to run that last wire. So most of the time, you'll say, unless it's, if you had very small grids 1,000 miles apart, that might not be smart. But if you're 50, 100 miles, and you can make a connection between two, and you get all the benefits of, I've now got more diversity of supply, more diversity of demand. It's like adding one more stock to my portfolio, right? It's going to be the same math, more or less, that I don't own one stock. You shouldn't, you need diversity in there, and that helps optimize. So generally, it moves towards a portfolio that's very diverse.
My name is Walter McLeod. I had a question about your investments in renewable energy and how they align with your core business interests. So when you invest in a project, is it with the idea that you are going to somehow be an off-taker of that energy, or is it just to promote, more renewable energy, for more people?
Yep.
And does that answer differ if you're here in the United States investing in the project versus someplace like sub-Saharan Africa in Lake Turkana, for example?
Yeah. So far, we have not been off-taker and investor in the same project. That doesn't mean we wouldn't, but it's not generally. We look at where our data centers are, and that drives the off-take. So we want to make sure that we're in the same balancing area as our data center, so that we have a legitimate nexus. We're not just buying, so we try to look for that nexus of what's generating the power and where we off-take. And that's the way we think about category A. On investment, we look for, generally we'll look for regions where we want to develop expertise, or countries where we want to develop expertise, and then go deeper in those countries. And so we started with the US, we've done some in Europe, we're now doing more in sub-Saharan Africa. We'll look at other regions as we move forward, but that's more of a function of the expertise we have and our ability to understand the risk return. But they're not, we generally keep them fairly separate. Now you can connect them, and we might see more over time of connecting those two.
Thank you. Eli Redigo, visiting scholar at George Washington University. Investing in renewables made a lot of business sense up until a year ago. And then oil prices drastically fell. And suddenly, generating electricity from renewables became much less competitive when comparing to oil and gas. Has that affected Google's decisions in investing in renewables? If not, will it, as oil prices will remain low in the next year, if they remain low in the next following years? Yeah. Thank you.
Well, first, I would separate oil from natural gas. So oil generally is going to be more transportation focused, and what affects in the U.S., what affects the prices of electricity is generally natural gas. But they've both gone down. So natural gas prices have gone from $8, $9, $10 pre-2008 down to $3 and fairly stable at that level, and that definitely affects the pricing of PPAs. It affects alternatives. But the big driver, a lot of the big driver is renewable mandates. So in California, they were mandated brown can't compete with green. So I've got 33% renewables moving to 50, and I can't sell power from a natural gas plant into those concessions. What has happened, though, while the cost of the alternative has gone down with natural gas, has also been technology's been making big advances. So if you look at the cost of wind and solar PV, it's gone down about the same ratio. So if you take solar, it's gone down by a factor of 2 to 3 over the same period. Wind has gone down. Wind was already lower, but wind has consistently improved over that period. So right now, wind in the Midwest can outcompete. You're getting wind PPAs, and this is the public numbers are in the $30 to $40 range, and that competes fairly or even lower, and that can compete with power generated by natural gas. So it's made it tougher. But the technology curve has actually allowed renewables. There's still projects out there. They're still good to invest in. It hasn't stopped investment, and so we still continue to invest. And the first part of your statement is the only one I wouldn't agree with, which is it was great until a year ago or 2 years ago. It's continued to be pretty attractive. So.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. I'll leave it to you to choose.
Hi, my name is Eric. I'm from the Swedish Embassy. And I was thinking, do you believe that, or do you think that innovation and technology will be able to solve these carbon emissions problems we have? Or do you think it's also a lifestyle problem? And if it's a lifestyle problem, what do you think Google can do to communicate climate change and carbon emission levels? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think technology can do a lot and will do a lot and has already. So as we look at the innovation rates in just renewables, they've been staggering. We need to focus on things like, it was mentioned this morning by David Crane, we still don't forget about things like carbon capture and storage with natural gas and nuclear and some of the other categories that we need to make sure we continue to innovate in as well. But there's a big difference between efficiency and conservation and even demand response. So, and if you think about lifestyles, it's really tough to get people to change. I'm going to be a little more miserable is a tough sell. So I'm going to put on sweaters and I'm going to, that's a very, very tough sell. But I'm going to allow you to put a thermostat in my house that's going to change my set point when I'm not home and going to still provide me more or less the same level of comfort. You just shift it down when I'm not there, or it self-tunes and improves. That's proved that with Nest, that's proven incredibly effective and drives down your energy usage without perceptively changing your lifestyle. So what we tend to look at are things that can, without changing your actual, your comfort, can still allow you to use less. And then the last part, though, of that leg is efficiency. And I think if you look at things like LED lighting, I have the same level of lighting in my house that I used to, but it's now 1/5 of the energy consumption, to the point where it's almost uninteresting to flex lighting because it consumes so little if you actually deploy the most efficient technology. So I think efficiency and technology can drive efficiency. It can drive more interaction and more willingness to engage with the grid through things like demand response. But the third category of being colder in winter and warmer in summer is you're going to get very minor savings out of it, and it's a very tough one. So I tend to think that's a tougher one to deal with. And that might be more of a U.S. issue than a European, but I don't know. Sure.
Well, on that note, I wanted to thank you for joining us today. I think you've shed a lot of light on everything from renewables to autonomous vehicles and from Paris to Lake Turkana. So we really appreciate your valuable insight on energy, climate, and the view from Google. So thank you again for your time today.
No, thanks for having me.